July 1456. The fate of Christian Europe hangs by a thread. A massive Ottoman army, over 100,000 strong, stands at the gates of Belgrade. Leading them is Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, the man who shattered the Byzantine Empire just 3 years earlier. Now, he turns his gaze northward, toward the heart of Hungary, toward Vienna, toward Rome itself. Between him and total domination stands one city, one fortress, and a collection of peasants, crusaders, and desperate soldiers who refuse to surrender. This is the story of 19 days that changed the course of history. 19 days when ordinary people became legends. 19 days when the bells of Europe rang out not in mourning, but in triumph. This is the Siege of Belgrade, 1456. Imagine standing on those walls, watching an army so vast it covers the horizon like a dark sea. You are a farmer, not a soldier. The man beside you is a blacksmith. Behind you, an old priest holds a crucifix with trembling hands. You have never fought before. You have never killed before. And yet, here you are, because someone must stand. Because if not you, then who? Would you have stayed? Would you have fought knowing the odds? That question haunts every story of courage throughout history. And perhaps it haunts you too, wondering what you would do when everything is on the line. If you are watching this video, let me know in the comments where you are watching from. And don't forget to subscribe. The thunder of Ottoman cannons would soon shake the very foundations of the medieval world. But before we witness the fury of that siege, before we stand with the defenders on those crumbling walls, we need to understand what brought an empire to this single point on the map. We need to understand why Belgrade mattered more than any other city in Europe at that moment in time. The Ottoman Empire in 1456 was not merely powerful, it was unstoppable. Since the early 1400s, Ottoman forces had carved through the Balkans like a scythe through wheat. Serbian despots had fallen. Bulgarian czars had been crushed. Byzantine emperors had watched their 1,000-year empire reduced to rubble. On May 29, 1453, Constantinople, the queen of cities, fell to Mehmed's relentless assault. The walls that had protected Christendom for over a millennium crumbled under the weight of massive bronze cannons, some capable of hurling stone balls weighing over 600 kilograms. The psychological impact of Constantinople's fall cannot be overstated. For medieval Christians, it was as if the earth itself had split open. The city of Constantine, the new Rome, the impregnable fortress that had withstood countless sieges, was now in Muslim hands. Pope Nicholas V called for a crusade, but Europe was fractured, divided, exhausted by the 100 Years' War and internal conflicts. Who would stand against this unstoppable tide? Mehmed had a vision. He saw himself as the heir to Rome, the ruler of a universal empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. Constantinople was merely the beginning. Now, he needed to break through into Central Europe, and the key to that breakthrough was Belgrade. The fortress city sat at the confluence of the Sava and Danube rivers, a strategic choke point that controlled access to Hungary and beyond. Take Belgrade, and the road to Vienna lay open. Take Belgrade, and the Ottoman flood would sweep across Europe unchecked. The Hungarian kingdom understood this perfectly. King Ladislaus V, still a teenager, watched helplessly as his kingdom teetered on the brink. The real power lay with John Hunyadi, the voivode of Transylvania, a man whose name struck fear into Ottoman hearts. Hunyadi was no ordinary commander. He was a veteran of countless battles against the Turks, a tactical genius who had defeated Ottoman armies at places like the Battle of Nis and the Battle of Kunovica. He understood Ottoman warfare. He understood their strengths and, more importantly, their weaknesses. But Hunyadi was aging, his body worn down by decades of warfare. When news reached him in early 1456 that Mehmed was gathering an enormous army for a campaign against Belgrade, Hunyadi knew this would be his final stand. He sent urgent messages across Hungary, calling for troops, for supplies, for anyone willing to fight. The response was lukewarm. The Hungarian nobility, jealous of Hunyadi's power and suspicious of his ambitions, offered little support. Professional soldiers were scarce. Money was scarce. Time was running out. Enter Giovanni da Capistrano, known to history as John of Capistrano, a Franciscan friar in his 70s who should have been spending his final years in quiet contemplation. Instead, Capistrano became a force of nature. He traveled through Hungary and the surrounding territories, preaching with such fervor that peasants abandoned their fields to follow him. He spoke of holy war, of defending Christendom, of martyrdom and salvation. His words ignited something primal in the hearts of common people. Thousands upon thousands answered his call. These were not professional soldiers. They were farmers, blacksmiths, merchants, and laborers. They carried crude weapons, pitchforks, axes, hunting bows, whatever they could find. But they carried something else too. They carried faith, burning and absolute. By late June 1456, Belgrade's situation had become desperate. The fortress garrison numbered perhaps 5,000 to 7,000 men under the command of Mihaly Szilágyi, Hunyadi's brother-in-law. They watched from the walls as the Ottoman army approached. What they saw must have frozen the blood in their veins. Mehmed's army was a marvel of military organization. Contemporary sources suggest anywhere from 100,000 to 300,000 men, though modern historians generally estimate between 60,000 and 150,000 troops. The corps consisted of the Janissaries, elite infantry units taken as children from Christian families, converted to Islam, and trained to be the finest soldiers in the world. These men fought with matchlock arquebuses, composite bows, swords, and pikes. They were disciplined, fearless, and loyal only to the Sultan. Supporting them were Sipahi cavalry, feudal horsemen who received land grants in exchange for military service. These were the shock troops, armed with lances, sabers, and composite bows capable of devastating charges or rapid flanking maneuvers. Then came the Akinci, irregular light cavalry used for raiding, scouting, and harassment. They spread terror wherever they went, burning villages and taking prisoners. But the true terror of Mehmed's army lay in his artillery train. The Sultan had learned well from the conquest of Constantinople. He brought with him massive bronze cannons, some weighing several tons, capable of hurling stone projectiles that could shatter medieval fortifications. Smaller bombards and mortars supplemented these monsters, creating a symphony of destruction. Engineers, sappers, and miners accompanied the artillery, ready to dig tunnels beneath walls or construct siege towers. The Ottoman fleet on the Danube numbered around 200 vessels, everything from large galleys to smaller riverboats. These controlled the river approaches, cutting off potential relief and supplying the besieging army. The noose was tightening. On July 4, 1456, the Ottoman army reached Belgrade and began encircling the fortress. Mehmed established his headquarters on a hill overlooking the city, his magnificent pavilion a symbol of imperial power. From there, he could observe every aspect of the siege. His engineers began constructing siege works, earthen ramparts to protect the artillery, and trenches that crept closer to the walls each day. Belgrade itself was a formidable defensive position. The fortress consisted of an upper town and a lower town, protected by thick stone walls, towers, and a moat. The upper fortress sat on a rocky promontory where the Sava River met the Danube, making it nearly impossible to approach from two sides. But the walls were old, built in earlier centuries, and not designed to withstand modern artillery. Mehmed knew this. He positioned his heaviest cannons to target specific sections of wall, planning to create breaches through which his troops could pour. The bombardment began on July 5th. The sound was unlike anything the defenders had heard before. Each cannon shot was a thunderclap. Each impact sent tremors through the earth. Stone balls, weighing hundreds of kilograms, smashed into the walls with horrifying regularity. Dust and debris filled the air. Sections of wall began to crack, to crumble, to collapse inward. Day and night the cannons roared. The defenders worked frantically to shore up the damaged sections, piling earth and timber behind the crumbling stone, but it was like trying to hold back the sea with bare hands. One defender later wrote, "The earth trembled beneath us with each strike. We could not hear each other speak. Men went mad from the noise alone. We thought the world was ending." By July 14th, after 10 days of continuous bombardment, significant breaches had opened in the walls. Mehmed saw his opportunity. He ordered his miners to dig beneath a key tower on the southeastern section of the fortress. When the tunnel was complete, they packed it with gunpowder and collapsed the entire structure. The explosion could be heard for miles. A massive gap now yawned in Belgrade's defenses, but something unexpected was happening beyond the Ottoman siege lines. John Hunyadi had not been idle. Despite his limited resources, he had managed to gather a relief force of around 10 to 15,000 troops and approximately 200 ships and boats of various sizes. More importantly, he had John of Capistrano and his crusader army of perhaps 20 to 30,000 peasants. This ragtag force began moving down the Danube toward Belgrade in early July. The Ottoman fleet blocked the river approach. On July 14th, the same day the tower fell, Hunyadi's flotilla encountered the Ottoman naval blockade. What followed was a brutal river battle, ship grappling with ship, soldiers fighting hand-to-hand on crowded decks, vessels ramming and sinking each other. Hunyadi himself led from the front, his flagship pushing through the Ottoman line. The fighting was chaotic and desperate. A Hungarian soldier recalled, "I watched men drown in their armor, pulled down by the weight of steel in the current. The river ran red that day. We fought not as an army, but as individual souls fighting for breath, for life, for one more moment." Against all odds, Hunyadi's fleet broke through. By evening, his ships were unloading men and supplies within Belgrade's harbor. The defenders, who had been on the verge of despair, suddenly found new hope. Hunyadi entered the fortress and immediately took command. He assessed the damage, repositioned troops, and began planning not just defense, but counterattack. Mehmed was furious but undeterred. He intensified the bombardment and prepared for a massive assault. On July 21st, he gave the order. At dawn, Ottoman forces attacked the breaches in overwhelming numbers. Janissaries led the assault, their discipline evident in their organized formations. They carried scaling ladders, shields, and hand weapons. Behind them came wave after wave of infantry, determined to overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers. The fighting at the breaches was apocalyptic. The defenders met the assault with everything they had: crossbow bolts, arrows, stones dropped from above, boiling water, burning tar, and hand-to-hand combat in the narrow gaps. Hunyadi was everywhere, rallying men, plugging gaps in the line, fighting alongside common soldiers. Sieae commanded another section of wall with equal ferocity. For 6 hours, the assault continued. Ottoman troops managed to plant their banners on several sections of wall, only to be thrown back. Bodies piled up in the breaches, creating macabre obstacles. The defenders fought with the desperation of men who knew defeat meant death or slavery. The Janissaries fought with the discipline of elite warriors who had never known defeat. By midday, the assault faltered. The Ottomans pulled back, having suffered enormous casualties without securing the fortress. But Mehmed was not finished. He ordered another assault for the following day. That night, the defenders worked frantically to repair the walls, knowing they could not survive another day of such fighting. July 22nd dawned with renewed Ottoman bombardment, even more intense than before. Mehmed threw everything at Belgrade. This was to be the final assault, the knockout blow. Around noon, the attack began. Janissaries and regular infantry charged the breaches again. This time, Ottoman forces managed to penetrate deeper into the fortress. Fighting raged in the streets of the lower town. For several hours, the outcome hung in the balance. John of Capistrano, despite his advanced age, moved among the crusaders, holding aloft a crucifix, shouting prayers and encouragement. His presence galvanized the defenders. When a section of wall looked ready to collapse, Capistrano's crusaders threw themselves into the gap, fighting with a ferocity born of religious fervor. One crusader remembered, "We did not fight as soldiers. We fought as men possessed." Father Capistrano told us we were God's instruments, and in that moment, we believed him absolutely. Death meant heaven, victory meant glory. There was no fear. Again, the Ottomans were thrown back. Mehmed's fury must have been terrible to behold. He had conquered Constantinople with this very army, using these very tactics. Now, a collection of peasants and a dying warlord held him at bay. But the defenders were exhausted, depleted, running out of ammunition and supplies. Hunyadi knew they could not survive another day of assault. He made a decision that would become legendary. Rather than wait for another Ottoman attack, he would attack them. On the evening of July 22nd, he began planning a sortie against the Ottoman siege lines. What happened next remains somewhat controversial among historians, as the sources conflict. What is clear is that on the afternoon of July 22nd, possibly without Hunyadi's explicit orders, thousands of crusaders, led by John of Capistrano, spontaneously charged out of the fortress gates. These were not professional soldiers executing a carefully planned maneuver. This was a mass of religious zealots, driven by faith and fury, pouring out of Belgrade and straight into the Ottoman siege works. The Ottomans, exhausted from hours of assault and not expecting a counterattack, were caught off guard. The Crusaders overran forward positions, captured several smaller cannons, and began attacking the Ottoman camp itself. The situation rapidly spiraled into chaos. Hunyadi, seeing what was happening, had two choices: recall the Crusaders and watch them be slaughtered, or commit his professional troops to support them. He chose the latter. Hungarian and Serbian cavalry burst from other gates, smashing into Ottoman flanks. What had begun as a disorganized mob charge became a full-scale battle. The fighting spread across the siege lines. Ottoman troops, who had been confident of victory just hours before, now found themselves fighting for survival. The Janissaries held their positions with characteristic discipline, but the irregular troops began to waver. Mehmed himself rode into the thick of combat, trying to rally his men. An arrow or crossbow bolt struck him in the thigh. He was carried from the field, bleeding and in pain. With their sultan wounded and the situation deteriorating, Ottoman commanders made the decision to withdraw. The withdrawal threatened to become a rout as Hungarian cavalry pursued the fleeing troops. By nightfall, the Ottoman army was in full retreat. They abandoned much of their artillery, supplies, and equipment. The great siege engines, those massive cannons that had terrorized the defenders for weeks, were left behind, too heavy to move quickly. The siege of Belgrade was over. The casualty figures remained disputed. Ottoman losses were certainly substantial, possibly ranging from 10 to 30,000 dead, wounded, or captured. The defenders and their crusader allies likely suffered several thousand casualties as well. But numbers alone cannot capture the magnitude of what had occurred. Against overwhelming odds, a medieval fortress had held. An army that had conquered the greatest city in the eastern Mediterranean had been defeated by peasants and a dying general. The seemingly unstoppable Ottoman advance into Europe had been halted. But the victory came at a terrible price. Within weeks of the battle, plague swept through both the victorious army and Belgrade itself. John Hunyadi, that great warrior who had saved Europe one final time, contracted the disease. On August 11, 1456, less than 3 weeks after his greatest triumph, John Hunyadi died. He was around 68 years old. His body gave out just as he secured his legacy. 3 months later, in October 1456, John of Capistrano also died, likely from the same plague. The two men who had embodied the defense of Belgrade, who had inspired thousands to stand against the impossible, were gone. Yet their sacrifice resonated across Europe. Pope Calixtus III had ordered church bells to be rung at noon every day, calling Christians to pray for the defenders of Belgrade. When news of the victory arrived, those bells became a celebration. The tradition continues in many Catholic and Protestant churches to this day, the noon bell ringing as a commemoration of that July day in 1456 when Europe was saved. The Ottoman Empire did not collapse. Mehmed II would go on to conquer vast territories in Anatolia and the Balkans. But he never took Belgrade. He never broke through into Hungary. The momentum of Ottoman expansion into Central Europe was broken. It would be another 70 years before the Ottomans would seriously threaten Vienna, and by then, Europe had changed, had modernized, had learned how to resist. The Siege of Belgrade stands as a testament to what courage, faith, and desperate determination can achieve. It reminds us that history is not predetermined, that the underdog can triumph, that ordinary people can perform extraordinary acts. Those peasants who followed a 70-year-old friar into battle, that aging general who refused to surrender, those defenders who stood on crumbling walls facing an empire, they changed the world. 19 days. That is all it took. 19 days of bombardment, assault, death, and defiance. 19 days that echoed through centuries. When you hear church bells ringing at noon, remember Belgrade, remember Hunyadi, remember Capistrano, remember that freedom, that civilization itself, sometimes hangs by the thinnest of threads, and that thread is held by those brave enough to stand.